Well, welcome to Debbie's Back Porch. I'm baking again today. I have a very special recipe I got from my friend Barbara Geiger. This is Amish White Bread. And I'm going to try to stick to her recipe, but I had to make a couple changes because I'm snowed in and couldn't get to the store. So here is the recipe as I made it, almost exactly the way Barbara wrote it. And if you want the original recipe, the full recipe with all of Barbara's directions, you can find it in the files of my cooking group on Facebook, Cooking from Scratch on Debbie's Back Porch. And if you join there, you have access to 1,000 recipes. So if you like this video, give us a thumbs up. I'll post a link to the group in the info section. And now let's get cooking. So in my very short baking career, I have learned that you need to measure out all your ingredients first. This is a cup of warm water. I have white sugar. I have a teaspoon of sea salt, active dry yeast, and that's the sugar. And I have a cup of warm cream. Now, Barbara used evaporated milk. I didn't have any. I'm using heavy cream. You could probably use whole milk. And these are my 2 cast iron bread pans. And we'll start by proofing the yeast. Now my milk and my water are between 90 and 100 degrees. You really don't want to get a whole lot over that. But at about 90 degrees you get some good rise out of your yeast. And this added the milk and the water and the sugar, and I'm going to mix those together and add the active dry yeast. You could use instant yeast. You don't have to proof it. You can. It doesn't matter. They're interchangeable. So we're going to pour this in and stir it up. Now, once this gets stirred up, we're going to let it sit and rest for 5 to 10 minutes until it starts getting bubbly. And you don't have to let it turn all the way to a creamy froth. You just are checking to make sure that your yeast is alive. Because yeast is a living thing. If it's out of date, it could be dead. So see, we've got some bubbles here. I'm going to stir this up just a little bit. This is good yeast. I don't know it's good yeast because I just made bread with it yesterday. And it worked fine. And this, by the way, is called proofing. So we're ready to go forward. I'm going to add my 1/4 cup oil, 2 ounces, and it's at room temperature. You could warm it, but it's at room temperature. And the salt. And be sure you follow the directions exactly on salt, because too much salt can kill your yeast and stop your rise. So we've got all that mixed together. We're ready for the mixer and the dry ingredients. And you can make bread without a mixer, but when your hands get old, it makes it so much easier. So I'm measuring my flour. This is going to take between 5 and 6 cups. There is a way to measure flour for bread. You spoon it into the cup. You don't dip the cup in. That aerates the flour. Then you level it off with something straight. I'm using the back of a knife. And that's important because whoever wrote the recipe, that's the way they measured it. I'm putting my little guard on here so I don't throw flour everywhere. And I may throw flour everywhere anyway. I'm going to mix this a little bit with the dough hook just to make sure that everything is mixed well. And then I'm going to gradually add the flour 1 cup at a time. The recipe says between 5.5 and 6 cups of flour. It's difficult to give you an exact amount because the weather and the temperature in your kitchen, lots of things can affect how much flour your recipe is going to need. So I'm putting it in 1 cup at a time and mixing well between cups. That was cup 1. This is cup 2. I'm letting the dough hook pull it together. And I think I'm going to take this off and scrape it down just a little bit to make sure everything gets mixed well. I have to say, one of the reasons I'm enjoying baking bread so much is because there is science involved here. Once you learn the science, you can do this. Cup 3 going in. On the other hand, it's not rocket science. There are just a few little things to learn about the way yeast and gluten interact that sort of demystify bread making. It really helped me a lot. For example, the temperature of the water you use, over 115 degrees or so, can kill your yeast. If it's too cold, it takes too long for the gluten to develop. And those things are written into the recipes if you're watching for them. So we're getting ready for cup 5. So cup 5 is going in, and I told you I'd get flour everywhere. And what we're watching for now to determine how much of that last cup we put in is to make sure that the dough is all coming together and that it's pulling away from the bowl and it leaves the bowl clean. And we're just about there. I'm only going to add a half cup. That's a scant half cup because I think we have enough. If it doesn't all come together and pull away from the bowl, I may add a little bit more. And if it's too stiff, I may add just a teaspoonful of water. But I think we've got it just where we want it. See how it's pulling away from the bowl and coming together. It's still a little shaggy, but that's enough. You'll see, that's enough. On another day in the same kitchen with the same ingredients, it might need all 6 cups because bread is a living thing, and I like to say it's magic. So when it all comes together, we're going to start timing the knead. Let me take this off. And this recipe calls for kneading on a fairly high speed. I'm going to have it on medium because it'll start rising in the bowl, and you don't want that to happen. But I don't want to over knead, so I'm setting my timer for 8 minutes, and I'll check it. We may have to go the full 10. So how do you know when it's kneaded enough? Well, there's something called the window test or window pane test. And you take a little piece out, you can wet your hands or oil them, and the dough should be elastic enough that it doesn't break when you pull on it. This is not ready. We're going to do the other 2 minutes. 2 more minutes, and I don't know if you can see it. I never know on a video, but you can see the difference in this dough. It becomes almost shiny. And when you pull it, and I'm not being particularly careful with it, but it's very elastic. And if you can pull it so that you see light through it, it has been kneaded enough. The proper gluten, you see that? The proper gluten has developed. This is going to be wonderful bread because you've thought just a little bit about the science involved in making bread. So I have a little flour, not a whole lot of flour, but a little flour here on this silicone mat. And I'm going to turn this bread out. And you see how cleanly that comes out of the bowl? This is just wonderful dough. It's pulled together nicely. It's elastic. It almost feels creamy when you work it in your hands. And we're just going to form it into a ball and get it ready for its first rise. And I just have to tell you, this is, to me, amazing. I have oiled this bowl, this plastic bowl. I got this bowl just for rising dough, for proofing dough, because I hate plastic wrap. And this would be airtight if I closed both sides, but I'm not going to close both sides. This is going to form gas while it's rising, so you don't want to make it airtight. And this wouldn't be one of my videos if I didn't make a mistake. I needed more oil, and I needed to turn it and make sure there was oil on both sides. And I failed to do that. It's only been about 30 seconds, so it hasn't started rising yet. I'm going to put a little bit more oil in this bowl, enough so that I can turn the dough and have just a tiny little bit of oil all around it. And that is important. That's why I stopped and came back to do it. So you put it in top side down and let that get oiled, and then flip it over. And then we'll put our cover back on, and I will put this at a warm spot in my kitchen over there by my stove. You want to let this rise for about 45 minutes or until it's doubled in size, and you need about 75 to 80 degrees for that. And this is what you're looking for. It took about 40 minutes. And I'm going to show you how to test it and make sure that it has risen enough. So if you poke 2 fingers down in it, and when you pull your fingers out, the holes stay, your dough is ready. See, they stay, they don't fill back in. So we're going to turn this out now on my floured board, and then we're going to punch it down. Now the reason you punch it down, and that's actually what you do is you punch it down, is that you want to deflate it. And as you do that, you'll see there's air trapped inside. Little bubbles will pop up. And you want to burst as many of those bubbles as you can, because they'll leave holes in your bread. And they'll make more bubbles as you work it. Now I'm going to form this into a rectangle so I can sort of eyeball cutting this for 2 loaves. One of my pans is bigger than the other, so I'm going to cut one piece just a little bit bigger than the other. But I find it easier if you sort of make it into a rectangle. And my little dough scraper here has, it's 6 inches, it has a measurement on it. So I'm going to put about 1 inch more in one pan than the other, so that I get kind of a similar rise between the 2 pans. Like that. And you can cut it with a knife. You don't have to have this dough scraper. And we're going to work this into loaves, and I'll be back. So I've already done one, and I'll show you how I do this. I form it into a rectangle, and I'm rolling it with my rolling pin, which I've floured just a little bit. You don't have to use a rolling pin. If your hands are strong enough, you can pat it out, but you're going to have bubbles, and you want to break as many of those bubbles as you can, and you want to get this, a lot of the gas out of it. I guess you'd call it gas. It's air, and get it, oh, I don't know, this is probably 1/4 to 1/2 inch thick. And you want this to be approximately the width of your pan. There are many ways to form a roll. You can just bunch it up. You can roll it up like a cinnamon roll. I'm going to do the letter method, which just fold it in thirds like you would a business letter before you put it in an envelope. And then we're going to, I'm going to wet my fingers and pinch this together so it doesn't separate in the pan. I'll turn it around so you can see it. And I confess, I really need to do some practice on this pinching. Mine is not as pretty as I have seen other people do it, but it's going to serve the function. It's going to keep it from coming apart. You know, I've really never made a whole lot of bread. I've done a whole lot of studying of making bread, and I've been making bread, but that pinching needs a little work. So we're going to put it in with the folded side down and sort of press it down in there a little bit. And then we're going to cover this with the dreaded plastic wrap. You know, folks used to use a tea towel, and now we use plastic wrap. And I find that the tea towels would always deflate the bread. That's one reason I didn't make bread for so long. But I oil the plastic wrap, and I'm going to just loosely put that over. And then I'm going to set these 2 loaves over in my stove area, which is the warmest spot in the kitchen, and until they double in size, and we'll be back. This took about 25 minutes. It's in a nice warm spot in my kitchen. It might take longer if your kitchen's cooler. If you press in, an indentation stays. That says it has risen enough. You don't want it to be too far above the pan. You just want it to crown. We're going to put this in the oven, preheated to 350 for about 30 minutes. It'll take my stove 35, I promise. I have just learned that about my stove, but we're going to check it at 30 minutes. And you can see it's a beautiful brown color. And you know, if you thump on this, it sounds hollow, but we're going to make sure. We're going to check it with a thermometer. We want an internal temperature between 195 and 205, or it's really just not going to be the best quality bread. And you want that probe to be right in the middle of your bread. So this bread is not done, even though it looks done and it sounds done and it smells done. It was at 175. Back in the oven for another 5 minutes, I think, will be enough. And I actually set it for 7 minutes because I know my stove. And you'll know your stove after you've done this a while. So we're going to try it again. I'm going to put it right back in the same hole, right in the middle of the bread. Takes it just a few seconds to reach temperature. And I'll show you here, it's at 203. So this bread is going to be perfect. I'll take the other loaf out, and then I'm going to turn these out on a rack. Now, if you want your crust to be soft, you don't have to turn them out right away. I like my crust to be a little tough, actually, and I want it to be dry. So I'm going to turn these out right away. And yes, they sound hollow when you thump on them, but they sounded hollow before. So I just don't think that's the very best way to determine if it's done. The very best way to determine if it's done is the thermometer. I made a beautiful 6 braid challah the other day, and it just looked wonderful, and it was brown as it could be. And when you cut it, it was dense in the middle because it had needed to cook another 5 to 7 minutes. So I'm flipping these out. Cast iron's heavy. Just hold on with me. And not too shabby. I think Barbara will approve. And Barbara makes some beautiful bread. So I have a little bit of softened butter here because I like to brush softened butter on. You don't have to. It just gives me the texture and the look I like. And now for the hardest part. You have to wait until it cools. And it'll cool in an hour. It'll be fine to cut then, but don't cut it before that time is up because you'll tear it up, you'll mess up the crumb in the bread, and you'll be disappointed. I've waited an hour. I was good. And now we're going to test it. I'm going to cut off a piece, and look at that. Look at that. Isn't that beautiful? And when you feel it, it's soft. I've got to get some of that butter. So a little soft butter. And then this is the only test that really matters. We're going to taste it. And yes, there's nothing better than just slightly warm bread. Look at this texture. I like bread to have just a tiny bit of resistance to the teeth. And this is perfect. Thank you, Barbara, for allowing me to video your recipe. And I really hope, folks, that you will try this Amish white bread. This is just a perfect loaf of bread, going to stand up to a sandwich, going to make great French toast. You cannot go wrong with this bread. Thank you for joining us on Debbie's Back Porch. Hope to see you again tomorrow.